Hi, Gregg Perry, the historic preservationist. Welcome to our next episode for America's 250th anniversary with talking about taverns, specifically the Sign of the Key Tavern in Woodstown, which is New Jersey's oldest colonial tavern dating back to 1669. But today's episode, we're going to talk about uses of a colonial tavern. Um, and usage of these taverns varied much of the time that the tavern was developing the ambiance of taverns, which 1669 there were very few, if any, that are older than this in the entire colonial atmosphere. Um, at 1669, the Sign of the Key Tavern in Woodstown um, started out as a fur trading center, but I think its essence was going to be real estate because King William gave to John Shivers, who built the tavern in that 1665, 1667, and it opened in 1669. He gave him X amount of hundreds and hundreds of acres, thousands of acres to sell and to sell and create hamlets. So this was kind of a real estate outpost, if you would. And remember, you have to put your mind into it that there were no fields. There were no fields. I mean, it was wall to wall timber. Again, a squirrel could go to Maine to Florida, right through our area here, Alloway, Woodstown, and never touch the ground. Just walk across the canopies all the way down to Florida. And how we can destroy a country, can't we, in many ways, polluting and ripping trees down. And hey, trees use carbon dioxide, and that helps us with breathing. That's oxygen. So why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And well, anyway, that's for another time. But the bottom line is, so this tavern was put there as a place to sell real estate. Number one, its exact location is put there because, as we have spoken in a previous video, the royal port in Salem, is where the king came in. They built a warehouse around 1650 in the early 1650s, and it takes 8 to 8.5 miles to get to its old location, the Sign of the Key in Woodstown, and that was key. Uh, I read something a few days back, and I'm not going to explain whose book it was in, and he was very misguided in his information. He said when the traveler probably got tired and he was getting hungry and thirsty, and this was in a quote tavern book that's been out there, and uh, it's been advertised, locally in historical societies. I thought what it was quite a joke, in fact, that the goer, the man, would have been tired and hungry, and he wanted to stop somewhere. No, not so. Believe me, you could have gone further. It was the horse that got tired. The horse needs to be boarded. The horse's legs are weak and it's hungry and it's tired. It needs to sit for an evening. That's why tavern, the placages for tavern, the stops for tavern were every 8.5 miles. So you would bring your horse. The horse would be boarded in the back. The tavern would usually have either some Native Americans at this point in time in the 17th century. We're talking here, the third quarter. You would have had Native Americans, possibly a slave or two, or young people boarding, feeding the horses, and then a furrier that may come around once a week to tend to the horse's shoes. And you could drop your horse if a horse was available, which probably only one horse at any other time addition would be available at that tavern, and you would take that to the next tavern. So conceivably, you could probably do 2 tavern runs in one day by trading in your horse. I don't know how that works. I haven't found anything about that. How do you know if your horse was better than his horse or the horse you got? So maybe all horses were on equal footings as far as the quality and the value of horses at the time. But nevertheless, that's why the Sign of the Key Tower was placed 8.5 miles from the royal port back in 1669. And we talked about the oddity of travel, but you're coming there, and the tavern was put there, and then they're looking to build the next tavern, the next tavern, the next tavern. The key here was to get up to Old Burlington, um, and it was actually going to be the capital of West Jersey, and that's what it became. So they were placing every tavern 8.5 miles up on, quote, Old King's Highway. And as we explained before, it took it could take years to cut this timber, burn it, so that you could have carriages and horses able to not go around the stumps. So it became very difficult. But so it became a place to sell real estate. And then John Chivers did a lot of bartering with the Native Americans, and he felt that they had friendly relationships, so they started bringing in hides and actually some coats that or cloaks that the Native Americans were making, and they were going to barter them out of his tavern in what would become Woodstown, New Jersey. So, fur trading center, real estate center, but his major objective was to sell land and reap a commission back from the king. Um, and as the tavern developed into 1670, 1671 and 2, they understood they had to have meals, they had to have drink, and probably not until 1674 did they need places to stay. They need some kind of lodging, but this was not a lodging tavern. Lodging taverns really didn't become apparent here in the colonies probably until the 1720s. So a good 40 years later, and you would have found it in major cities. Philadelphia was not on the map. Old Newcastle was not on the map. And very little was there. This was barren land with Native Americans and a lot of trees, and people of higher powers with money, with plans to put things and build communities where they wanted to. And this whole community, it's no different today that our corporations are created in an atmosphere where they dictate what our government does. It was the back then the government, you had people that could make supplies and goods. They're pressuring the government back in the late 17th century. They want to sell them. So they go to the government and they say, we have the new world with all these potential people, the population that could exponentially grow in 25, 30, 40, 50, 100 years, create these towns. And because my family produces this or that in England, and I can become a rich man. So they started producing and prodding and probably paying under the table the aristocracy to make this happen, such as this real estate affairs with John Chivers and the King of England. Uh, so what else did the tavern become? Again, a place for drink and eat. And as we spoke one of our last episodes, you could only get ale or cider in this place, but nobody was drinking the water because water was contaminated. People got sick from the bacteria and the viruses in the water, the runoff from some animals or the water off in general. We just don't know what's in the water. And babies were drinking ale. As soon as they stopped nursing, they were drinking ale. So, and you would only had a choice of one or two meals. So when you would come in the tavern, it was probably no choice. It was the meal of the day. It was porridge, or it could have been rabbit or venison, and that was it. And whatever drink was available. You put down, one amount of money, and you could sit and have more drinks in the tavern room, the cage bar room, which the sign of the key has. And they started very early because once the local inhabitants in this area found out the benefits of feeling better and relaxing from some of these alcoholic beverages, they were the highly sought after thing to be stolen. So that developed in a cage bar. So the tavern or the innkeeper, the tavern keeper, had was typically inside of the cage bar the whole night. So no one could go in there and lean over and steal some other alcohol. Um, so other than that, it was a place you have to envision. This was the only dwelling in this area, the only dwelling. There wasn't a church, there wasn't a city hall, there were no houses. So as people came to buy land, to barter for land from John Chivers, um, this provided them with information. There were pamphleteers who would stop by probably once a week, once every 2 weeks, and leave pamphlets inside the tavern. Not that people could read them, because you would have had other individuals that would possibly stop by that could read, and they would have a sign, or they would tell people that when they came in, there'll be a reading of news coming in on, Saturday afternoon at high noon. And people would come, a few people would come to listen to the news about the war with England, about a new hamlet, a new town is there's houses being built, what they're going to call it, things of this nature. And as we got into around 1700, then you would have had church services here, multi-denominational services, not just one at different times. You would have had political speeches given here from both sides. Probably not at the same time, because the capability of the Sign of the Key Tavern was probably maximum only of about 20 individuals could stay in there. Um, so political. So who was in charge? Were the British in charge of southern New Jersey, or were the colonials? So and the tavern owner, or the tavern keeper, he was going to swing either way, because he wants to sell stuff. He wants to sell his meals, his drinks, his lodging, his furs, his real estate. So whoever's in charge militarily, he's going to cater to them, whether he was pro this or pro that. And the another interesting thing is, as we got into the 1720s, 1730s, 40s, and 50s, there was a lot of whippings. There would have been a whipping post outside of the tavern. There would have been sometimes people would have been hung outside of a tavern, and it's like this craziness, this brutality of this ridiculous MMA fighting that the young kids see today. And the tavern owners were happy to have a whipping, or multiple whippings scheduled, or even a hanging, because he would have more people coming out of the woods with advance notice, and he would sell meals and drink, as crazy as that sounds. And this would probably be pushing into the 1720s. So, and we'll talk about briefly the different kinds of taverns. So we have the tavern like the Sign of the Key we're talking about now, which provided, after it got running by 1775, meals, drink, and lodging. And lodging was by no means luxury. It was sleeping on one room, the room that was above the chimney, where the chimney was in the wall for the cooks, the 11-foot open hearth. That would have been about 20, 25 degrees warmer in the winter, but it would have been sweltering hot in the summer. If you wanted to rent into that room, you could, and they would give you a lighter blanket to sleep there on a bed, and the bed would hold anywhere from 8 to 10 people, and people you don't even know, and you would stay fully dressed and just find a more comfortable place. And sometimes it was stuffed with hog and horse hair, and with hay, or within corn husks, things of that nature. The cheaper room was the room that was not around in the wintertime, was not around the fireplace going through the wall, and you would have had a heavy burlap blanket and slept on the floor. So each at the Sign of the Key would hold about 10 to 12 people in each one, and the accommodations were not good. And you would go outside, and to do your business outside, there was no there was no commodes upstairs to accommodate for bathrooms, so you'd have to go out in the middle of the night. I have no doubt that probably the people in the better room had one window out the front. Possibly they raised the window and went right out the window. I have no doubt about that. Somebody had at some time of the history of it. Um, so that was the accommodations. But I said we have somewhat about three types of taverns. Taverns you would have to buy after the hamlets, after the Sign of the Key was there for about 25 years, and you would have had the precursor to, say, Woodstown, where the Shivers Tavern was located, this first tavern from the Royal Port. You would have had a license needed to sell alcohol, and this was a way of our taxation kicking in to the British government, and then it became the American government. So you would have had either for ale or for beer, open all the time and for basically limited lodging, or you would have had some people who were farmers. And there is a local tavern now, and I got word it just came up for sale, and it was not on the route of the taverns we are talking about, because it was not considered a legitimate tavern. It was considered an alehouse in the day. And an alehouse would have been that alternative tavern that if you were a farmer or you had another business most of the year and you wanted to open on Sundays, you buy a license just to sell alcoholic beverages on a Sunday. And it's called Seven Stars. It was given that name only back in the 1948, in the late 40s and early 50s. So it wasn't a tavern back in the day. It was an alehouse. You'd stop by and you had a limited amount of time that you could sell drinks on a Sunday, and that was it. So it wasn't a full-blown tavern. We had an individual who actually ran the Historical Society in the late 40s, early 50s in that tavern, the Seven Stars Tavern, which he coined the name of Seven Stars. And he was a professor at a Philadelphia University institution. And back then, as we know, coming out of the war, um, people were very oppressed. They weren't into history, but the people that were into history really rewrote a lot of books about history. And even today, we find ourselves in 2026, and we are finding history books being shelved, burned, thrown out, and history has been being rewritten as we watch this video after today. So those 40s and 50s, and this individual went in and he totally flipped this tavern from a farmhouse, and he put a pent roof on it, he put an extension on it, and he gave it an interior of a tavern, and he called it a tavern. And as we have a lot of the people today, the automatons people, the quote, we're going to term, and it's a good term, it's a psychological term, the stupid people, the following the herd type people, they believe what they see and they don't cognitively go deep into creative thinking and think about what's going on. So a lot of people believe this, but that's what we have. So the third type of tavern, as the evolution occurred in the 1720s, 1725, we moved to 1750, places like Philadelphia, Haddonfield, the Indian Creek Tavern. These big taverns, they had 2 floors at the time. They could accommodate 30, 40 people. They had legitimate beds. They became boarding houses, almost hotels with cage bars on the downstairs and dinners available. So that was the ultimate expression. But when we're talking about the sign of the key, New Jersey's oldest colonial tavern, we're talking about the raw essence of an outpost here. So we're going to be joined by somebody, I think, coming up here. It's Mr. Sweets. And I think we're going to be leaving that, um, leaving our talk of taverns today. And I'm sure taverns, from what I've read in the diaries of John Shivers, they actually had a kitty in their tavern too. And he was a mouser because, with that food in the tavern, there were a lot of rats and mice. And you need one of these guys to be on pest control. So Gregg Perry, the historic preservationist, I'm signing off for Mr. Sweets, Gregg Perry. Thanks all for watching us. Thanks.